I'm very happy to see you, to meet you. I would like to share a PowerPoint with you because we'll speak now about geography, and I'm talking to you from Ainos, a city at the mouth of the river Hebros, Marița, Meric, today the frontier between Turkey, Greece, and Bulgaria. Where I am investigating with geomorphological, geophysical, and also with archaeological excavation, Byzantine harbor. In fact, I'm looking for an ancient harbor. I'm a classicist, but we identify the ancient harbor in the Byzantine harbor. So I would like to speak with you about what the ancient people and then the Byzantines could know about the geography of the earth. I would like to share the screen now to show you. Yeah, it was just an introduction to show you where I am now. So you can see here down. Can you see also my mouse, how it's moving on the screen? Yes, thank you. So yeah, I'm in the northern of the Aegean now, in the high excavation house, so in front of the Samothrace island at the mouth of the river Hebros. Today, in what it was in antiquity and until Byzantine times, a big maritime gulf, and there was the city of Ainos, the Greek city of Ainos, founded in the 7th century BC by the Greeks coming for Aeolis, and the city continued with good prosperity also during Roman times, because it was at a crossroad. All the people who went by sea from the Aegean to Thrace through the Hebros River, through this big maritime gulf, and then through the Hebros, and also all the people crossing from Anatolia to current Balkanic Greece, so to say. But the city declined in Ottoman times, in late Ottoman times, so from the 18th century onwards, due to the sedimentation of the river and to the politics, the separation between Greece and Turkey. We are really at the frontier of Turkey with Greece today. And I'm working on ancient geography, but since I'm doing excavation and working as a geo-arheologist, so also taking into account the colleagues who do geosciences, so reconstruction of paleo environments as geographers, biologists, geophysicists, and so on. I have to take into consideration the different times in order to look at the text and the maps, which could help these other colleagues. So as one more time, geographers, biologists, anthropologists, and so on, to reconstruct the landscape and their evolution and the place of the human being into the landscape. So it is in this interdisciplinary frame that I'm writing projects, and in this frame I'm looking at text, at the transmission, at the I'm trying to edit the text and to understand why they were written at some point and why they were transmitted, because I will speak with you especially about transmission when we speak about geography in Byzantium. So here I just put, for your information to know where I am now, some pictures. So we just come back. We were with the students in the territory of Ainos, and we are looking from the mountains to this Ainos city, which is on the sea, on the Aegean Sea, surrounded by some lagoons. And then my topic of an investigation during these years is the harbor. And what we can see as walls here, they are Byzantine, most probably starting from the 12th century AD. Also, the foundations could be already in Justinian times, 6th century AD, because Justinian fortified a lot of city. As you know, in this area, so 12th centuries, we can see things which were then restored during Byzantine times by a family which took over the possession of the city in the 14th century, the Gateluzzi, and creating a small empire in the northern of the Aegean. And then the city was given by one descendant of the Gateluzzi, a woman who was in bad relationship with her family, was given to Mehmed the Conqueror, to the Ottoman Sultan in 1456. So from that time, the city became Ottoman, but the population remained Greek until the 20th century, until 1923, when the exchange of population forced the people from Ainos to move across the border in Greece, in Alexandropolis, Samothrace, and so on. And in Ainos, we have a Turkish population who came from Bulgaria. For example, now we are excavating in the garden of someone whose father came from Bulgaria, from the Ottoman Empire, and was established here. So this is This is a little bit about Ainos and about what geography means when we are on the field. So we are looking at ruins, we are looking at connectivity, about how a settlement was existed as a geographical space, and how it was related with other settlements, because in modern geography we do not study a site in itself, but its network. So we are in the connectivity time, so to say. And here we have the map of Ainos and the harbor that we identified thanks to geomorphological drills, and which fits also the literary tradition, starting with the 5th century AD, Agatias, and also the architectural, these towers and the fortification we see for the harbor from the 12th century, the latest. So this all fits for a harbor in this area for Ainos. Here is the Meric River. In antiquity, it was the sea. The Ebros did not arrive yet here. And here we have lagoons, which in antiquity were still sea, open sea, but then they closed due to some sandbars brought by the currents of the Aegean Sea. And what I'm doing, comparing text and maps from different times. So I have to go from earliest sources, of course, up to the Ottoman, and you see here some 19th century Ottoman maps I'm trying to read in order to understand how the city was related with the other side of the river, which is now Greece, but also with the roads up to Byzantium and up to Çanakkale, to the Dardanelles Strait. And what I'm concretely doing, besides archaeological excavation, now we open an excavation really here at the gate of the city, of the Byzantine city, towards the ancient harbor, which we identified here. So I'm coordinating, working together with colleagues from Germany who do geophysics, like here we do electric profiles in order to see the water depth of the harbor, and then we have to do drillings, geomorphological drillings, to read the sedimentology and to make dates with C14 in order to see how deep it was the harbor at different times, if it could work or not. So this helps us to supplement the literary evidence, because for Ainos, we have Critobulus of Imbros in the 15th century. He was close to Mehmet the Conqueror, the Sultan, and he gives us a lot of information about Ainos. He tells us that Ainos was a rich city of the Gateluzi because of the salines, because of the connectivity of the harbor. We also have some sources from late antiquity, as I told you, Agatias, Procopius. We have a lot of remains, especially from the 12th century. I'm trying to understand if my working hypothesis these days is that this harbor, which existed there from antiquity, which was reworked in the 12th century, and it was well improved, consolidated, and then the fortification of the harbor appeared. So we are trying to put all this together and to take the best of the literary sources, but they are not enough. So this is why we complement with much more modern methods, which are also non-invasive as geophysics. So you don't let any trace on the field, and this is very good for the people who don't like to give their gardens for our excavation, or micro-invasive like geomorphology. So studying the history of the harbor. What for? In order to understand how the networks are going in Byzantine times. But I must confess, as a historian basis, a philologist and historian, also with a background in archaeology, that for Byzantine times in particular, it's very difficult to bring together the geographical texts, so the texts which are special devoted to space description, and the evidence on the field. It's already difficult for antiquity, and I'm a specialist of antiquity, but for Byzantine times, it is even more difficult. So the gap between scholarly tradition, between what one learned in school in Byzantium and the reality of the field, it's even greater, even if we have much more texts, of course, than in antiquity. So my topic of today is what ancient Byzantine people knew about the world. And in the end, is it possible to fill the gap between what we see, so the Byzantine ports we are investigating with archaeology and geoarchaeology, and this literary tradition transmitted from antiquity? First of all, so as I told you, I'm studying ancient geography, and you hear often speaking about empirical geography or mathematical geography. So working in the years 2010 in Berlin in the Topo Excellence Cluster, together with Klaus Geuss and our colleagues there, we tried to create a new categorization of texts which are related to space in antiquity, but also Byzantine times, because when we are dealing with ancient geography, I think we have a continuous and not really separated times up to modern times. So one could say up to Renaissance, the moment when other continents were discovered, but I would rather say until the 18th century, it is a continuity. And why until the 18th century? Because in the 18th century, people started to use modern maps for orientation, for traveling, and they started to use them in the 18th century because then the maps were precise, because at that point, people could measure the longitude on the field. So before all the maps for the longitude, there were only approximation, there were empirical guess. So this is why until the 18th century, all the maps cannot be used in real travels. It's more mentally, it's for learning, for contemplation, for a discussion, juridical, political, and so on discussion. But in the 18th century, you can have maps as we use it today with the GPS, so you can travel with a map. So in all this period, before the modern maps, before geography served really the orientation on the field, we have to understand what was geography and how people were speaking about the space, at least in Western cultures. So we could establish, looking at all the evidence in antiquity and also Byzantine up to Renaissance, some three categories which are not well determined. So there are passings, between the two categories, between the three categories. So the basic geography, so what people in the past knew about the space, we called it intuitive geography. So it's more or less if you take a peasant which is not educated. So if I go now on the street here in Enes and I take a Turkish citizen who was never in the school, and I ask him, what do you know about the Earth? So he could probably not know exactly how the sun and moon are moving for him, because he looks at the sky and he thinks that the others are moving and he is staying. But at least he could give some orientation, saying, yeah, so the east is there where the sun is rising and the west is there where the sun is going to set. So this is the basic level we can find in different texts in antiquity as well in Byzantium, what we called intuitive geography. And we find it in letters, in epistolae, we find it in school documents, we find it sometimes in theater or in some literary texts who try to show how people are ignorant, what is the worst knowledge, possible knowledge, the most naive, so to say, the most empiric level of geography. In antiquity, for example, we find it very nicely in Xenophon, who, as you know, at the beginning of the 4th century had to come back to Greece with 10,000 people from the Persian Empire. And he wants to show how great he was as a leader. And he quotes the geographical opinion of some of the soldiers who were totally lost there. And he said, yeah, I explained to the soldiers that Greece is where the sun is setting. So this is the basic level. And things did not change in Byzantium. It's still this kind of empirical, so to say, geography. Then we have a geography which is taught in school. So as soon as someone is going to school, the person learns how to read, and the learning of reading is done by text. So you read the text and the teacher can explain, this is a toponym, this is an ethnic, and so on. And this creates more or less some knowledge in the head or some mental maps in the best cases, and we'll call this choreography. I will explain you immediately. So in this category, we put a lot of authors and their transmission through Byzantium. When we have most of the time, historian, for example, he has this scholarly geography, what he taught in school, what he knows from books, what he has his general frame is. And then the third level of geographical training, so to say, so the person who is the most instructive in geography is usually a philosopher in antiquity or in Byzantium, a mathematician. So someone who knows about the sphere, the celestial and the terrestrial sphere, and who is able to put a place on the terrestrial sphere, so under the climates of the celestial spheres, and especially depending on the latitude, not the longitude. I told you the longitude was calculated scientifically only in the 18th century. second half of the 18th century. Before it was determined from periploid, from itinerary, and from meridians of references, which passed most of the time through Byzantium. I will show you more in the future. So when I'm speaking about geography in the stricto sensu, so in the narrow sense, I speak about what was invented in the 1st century BC in Alexandria, and I speak about this scientific mathematical geography. So about these people who know that the Earth is a sphere, which everybody who goes into school knows in antiquity and also in Byzantine times. And I speak about these people who are able to judge the places and the temperature and the quality of a people living at some point on the terrestrial sphere, and to make a horoscope to say or to determine their qualities. Who invented this geography? So the description of the terrestrial sphere, even if you don't represent it as a sphere, you can put it on a map in 2 dimensions, but you always know that this must be projected on a 3-dimensional round or sphere. Is Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who lived so in the 1st century BC Alexandria. He was both a philologist and a mathematician, a philosopher. And geography is in fact the synthesis between mathematics, Platonic mathematics, and philology. So the names and then calculating the distances in order to put them on the terrestrial sphere. This is how it started in the 1st century BC, Platonic tradition in Alexandria, and it went further through late antiquity to Byzantium and up to the Ptolemaic reception of the Renaissance. We will speak immediately about this. So Alexandria was a city, the capital of the Ptolemies, which encouraged a lot the geographers, Eratosthenes in particular, who was a trainer of Ptolemy III. And yeah, there are many things related with Alexandria in geography, many traditions, like the fact that, of course, the Ptolemies were considered the masters of Alexandria, which looks like a chlamys, like a Greek cloth. But also the earth was a clock, so chlamys. So we have this macrocosm, microcosm, and from there the start of a cartographic tradition at the local scale, but also at the global scale. Then geography passed to Rome, and even if the Romans, we do not have so technical, this highest geography, scientific geography, we do not have really Roman texts, but the Romans were trained in geography. Everybody was able to find the place where he was living on a terrestrial sphere. We know this from Ovidius, so in Ovid, you know, the poet exiled in Romania. We know this from Strabo, or who he wrote in Greek. We know this from Cicero and so on. And we see that the maps we have in the medieval Latin West have traces of this geography, even if these maps do not take into account always the sphericity of the Earth. So from Alexandria to Rome, and then through late antiquity, if we speak about maps, it is going especially to the medieval West. And this is one of the topics which interests me a lot in Byzantium. So why we do not have, after the 6th century AD, maps in the Byzantine, in the Eastern tradition, while in the Western tradition, we have a lot of maps in the Latin tradition. So I was studying medieval cartography with the earliest maps. We have maps from the 8th century. We know that they existed from the 5th, 6th, 7th century AD, but we have copies from the 8th, starting from the 8th century AD. We have, of course, the medieval Latin Mappa Mundi from the 14th century AD. They are magnificent, they represent the Earth, and we have updates with toponyms which appear in the medieval East. So a good question for a Byzantinist is why in Byzantium we do not have these maps, all this cartographic tradition of the West, why we do not have references to terrestrial globes, to the representation of the places where people are living on the Earth. We have references from the 9th century and always to celestial globes. We see in our icons, even, isn't it, Jesus and God keeping a sphere? This is always the celestial globe, so all the planets all together. In the middle of the celestial sphere there is the Earth, but we do not have representation of the terrestrial globe until the 15th century when we have it. So it's the so-called the globe of Columbus, and when we have it, it's always in the western parts, not in the eastern parts. In fact, what I put here, it's the latest, so to say, in original Byzantine, if we call it Byzantine, I would call it late antiquity map. It is in fact, it's coming from a manuscript of Cosmas Indicopleustes. The manuscript itself dates to the 11th century, but the map was done by Cosmas Indicopleustes in Alexandria in the 6th century AD. And it is really the last example, so to say, one of the latest examples of Byzantine cartography. What we see here, in fact, on the map of Cosmas is the Earth oriented to the north with the Mediterranean, which appears here. We have Europe, Asia, and Africa, with the Caspian Sea, which was considered since Eratosthenes, this inventor of geography, as an open gulf of the ocean. Here we have the Indian and the Persian Gulfs, so our oceans, and so of course a very reduced shape of Africa and of Asia. And here we have another island, which shows us that the ancient people imagined that other continents, so to say, could exist, but it is a fictional representation of paradise. Of course, we understand from these beliefs how Columbus went after the conquest of America. So this is Cosmas Indicopleustes, 6th century AD, continuing Eratosthenes, continuing even he was aware of other scholars of the 4th century BC, but the things are stopping in the 6th century AD. Also in the eastern parts of the Roman Empire, just like in the West, but especially in the East, we have in the 5th, 6th century, a very flourishing tradition of cartography, but more or less local, so rather chorography, let's say representations of regions, which do not take into consideration the sphericity of the Earth, but show how places, cities are situated one towards the other. And we see this tradition of chorographic representation of maps in mosaics, especially in the Near East. We have them in Madaba, for example, so in Syria, Israel, and so on, but also in Alexandria. So a lot of maps, and things are totally stopping in the 7th century AD. So this is a question, why this stop in the representation of the maps? And also, of course, with the fall of Alexandria and the going of the scholars, of the philosophers to Byzantium in the beginning of the 7th century AD, we have, let's say, a kind of stagnation in innovation in the geographic scientific tradition. Historians are simply repeating and compiling the texts or updating, so to say, texts which were written in antiquity. So all this deserves discussion, why they are not doing this kind of thing anymore after the fall of Alexandria, and why we do not have Byzantine maps, so to say, except copies from antiquity. The late antiquity is nevertheless a very important period in the West as in the East, because I think in late antiquity we can situate the origin of the Western Latin maps, and with that, with all our cartographic tradition for maps serving as teaching and contemplation, but also for maps used especially in relationship with religion, so to say, Christianization of the geography, of the representation of spaces. And what we see in late antiquity, before even the division between East and West, is the invention of orientation, so that the maps are put it to the East. This is orientation. And also we have, also in late antiquity, this starts in Hellenistic times, it is transmitted through Roman times, but in late antiquity it became stable in this scholar geography, in these maps which were used in order to teach text, to illustrate text. We have the stabilization of the shape of the Earth, of the inhabited Earth, of the oikumene on the terrestrial globe. And this shape, we can see it's rather rectangular or rounded or oval. And here we have a sketch, a cartographic sketch, which is one could say it's one of the very rare maps, Byzantine maps we have. It is coming from a manuscript in Moscow, a Byzantine manuscript, but it's of course just a scholar, a scholar studying text made this sketch from what he knew from other texts. So it's still a reproduction of the ancient tradition, because what we can recognize here is the shape of the oikumene, of the inhabited earth, as a sling in the tradition, textual tradition of Poseidonius of Apamea and of Dionysius of Alexandria. So there is absolutely nothing new in this so-called Byzantine map. We have just a sketch or what we knew already from Eratosthenes and especially Poseidonius then and Dionysius of Alexandria. So it's just recopying the ancient people and trying to learn their frame in order to make sense of the present day. So here it is again the Mediterranean. The map is oriented to the north, so the model goes before the invention of orientation to the east. Only for religion reasons, of course, because from the east the sun is coming, but the Christ is coming, and so on. The resurrection will come from the east. Here in the north, we are in a most ancient tradition already from Homer. It's the orientation after the polar star, isn't it? And we look to the north, to the latitude, we are in the northern hemisphere. So to the north, Europe, the Black Sea here, the Mediterranean, Sicily, represented as a triangle. Here are the winds written in the ancient tradition, very simplified. And here is Africa, Libya with the Nile Delta. And here we have Asia with the different gulfs I was telling you about here. So the Caspian, the Indian, and the Persian. So we just repeat the Eratosthenian tradition on this mental sketch. And exactly the same thing happens in the West. In late antique, and we have these sketches also through the medieval tradition in the West. But in the West, unlike on this rests of tradition, of ancient tradition in the East, in the Byzantine world, in the West, we have maps which are oriented to the East because they are, so to say, Christianized. So they are done for contemplation in order to follow the biblical history on them, for the Latin West, not in the East. Okay? And we'll try to understand why not in the Byzantine world. I would like to introduce you more in this study of geography and to understand with you what we can call, what we are talking about when we are talking about geography in ancient and in Byzantine world, how this geography was transmitted. Of course, we do not have the field of geography as a disciplina taught in school. This does not exist. This is totally modern times. It's 19th century, very modern. So how the geographical, the spatial information could be transmitted to people. I told you we have, in my opinion, these three major categories. So the geographical empiric knowledge of everybody who did not went to school, what we learn in school, which are these frames about what are the most important names we find in the texts we are reading or learning by heart. And this gave some orientation, some literary orientation, some scholarly orientation, school orientation. And then we have the highest level of geography, this with the terrestrial sphere, latitude, longitude, but once more time, longitude calculated only from itineraries and not measured scientifically until the 18th century. So it's about this shape of text I would like to talk now, before going to the question of the disappearance of the maps, which were one of the most important tools of learning geography and contemplating the creation in the Latin West, and that we do not have in the East, in the Byzantine world. So what is geography before modern times? What we can call geography before the 19th century invention of the field of research or of the scholarly academic discipline. We have texts which reflect the two vision of the earth. So one would be what the psychologists of the 20th century called the hodological space. So a person walking from a point to another. For example, now I am in Enes, and you would ask me to describe the space which is around me, and I say, okay, you are in Bucharest, and from Enes to Bucharest, I can describe you that I can take the bus and go to Istanbul, and then I can take another bus and go to Sofia, and then I take another bus and then I go to Bucharest. So this is an ontologic space. I describe like a metro map. I describe different points of an itinerary. But because I went to school and I saw maps, I can also say to you, okay, I'm in NS and you have to imagine, to remember the terrestrial globes and maps you have seen. So I'm in the north of the Aegean, I'm in front of the Samothrace Island, I'm at the mouth of the Hebros. In order to come to you, I should go towards the north, south to a more northern latitude. So this is a little bit two ways of seeing space, depending on the education of a human being. And this already appeared in antiquity. So if we take the 1st century BC Alexandria, where geography was invented, we had texts which are itineraries, like Apollonius of Rhodos describing the itinerary of the Argonauts, and we have Eratosthene, who took also names, but he put them on a bidimensional map, which in fact was a projection of the three-dimensional Earth terrestrial globe. And both texts have political, and both creations have political reasons. In both cases, the Ptolemies were paying for this. There is, so the political wish is not everything in this way of thinking. The difference comes from the Platonic philosophy and from the place of the number and the importance of the number in the mechanics, so to say, in the organization, in the structure of the world. So with Eratosthene, with geography, with the sphere, we are in the Platonic mentality, so that the number can determine the world, the shape of the world. And with Apollonius of Rhodos, we are in a poetical tradition of telling the itinerary. So I go from NS to Istanbul to Sofia to Bucharest and so on. And I do not complicate myself to tell you it's north, south, east, west, and how many degrees of latitude as a Platonician, as Eratosthenes would have tried to do. I would go a little bit faster in order to recall why geography was invented because Eratosthenes could do this because of the expedition of Alexander the Great. So he had access to a lot of geographical information, but also to distances, because Alexander the Great was accompanied by bematistai, so people who measured by their steps the distances up to Hindu Kush, up to northern India. So this is how Eratosthenes could have an idea, a better idea than all the speculations before him. So for example, Aristotle or Eudoxus and so on speculated about how big, how large can be our world, but nobody before Alexander the Great had data about real measures. So they had measures, so to say, about Anatolia, about a little bit about the center of the Achaemenid Empire, but only Alexander really measured by foot, step by step, and then they compared distances on sea with distances on land. They made estimation, and Eratosthenes is the first who can say, okay, I think the Ecumene occupies a quarter of the terrestrial globe. He's the first to say this, and after him, everybody took this model and tried to improve it to give the best precise distances of the oikoumene. So this is a condition, of course, in order to make the scientific geography, the Platonic geography. As you know, Eratosthenes is also the first who was able to calculate the terrestrial circumference. So this is why he was able to put the sphere and to put the oikoumene on the sphere, because he was also the first to have a quite precise estimation of the terrestrial circumference. Others before him tried, but they were quite wrong. So his method, solar method, was the best. And I think he did this because the Ptolemies tried to understand some cultural things related to their Serapeum in Alexandria. So what I want you to retain is that geography, this terrestrial globe positions, latitude, longitude, are all related to the Platonic school, to the philosophic schools, and this explains why not everybody is aware about geographical maps in Byzantium. It's only people who deal with mathematical philosophy in Byzantium, just like in ancient times. So this is a Platonic, so to say, mathematical training in order to put the places according to latitude, especially, and then longitude calculated, determined by projection from periploi. The map of Eratosthene is not preserved, so unfortunately no Byzantine manuscript transmitted as the text, the Geography of Eratosthene, so the treaty which has already the title of this word invented by Eratosthene, but we can reconstruct it, especially from Strabo and other texts which quote Eratosthene. In my opinion, Eratosthene was already lost in antiquity, so I do not think that it survived much after the 3rd century AD, 3rd or late antiquity maximum. So it was not lost during Byzantine times, but already in antiquity. Why? Because it was already replaced by more updated maps, but which are also quite lost for us. We only preserve Strabo. This is the curious thing. We preserve Strabo, which was the geography for us and for the Byzantine by excellence, but which was a text which was not read in antiquity until the 3rd century AD, until Athanasios of Naucratis. So, how people learn about spaces in antiquity and Byzantium? So we have to think about the history of teaching, how people were learning things in antiquity and Byzantium. They were learning at the general school by reading texts, of course. So in Latin West, they were reading Virgil, Aeneid, and they were reading translations of Homer. And in the East, from antiquity up to modern times, the Greeks were learning by heart Homer and then some other text, and they were, in order to learn by heart Homer, they had a lot of proper names they had to remember. So the teacher was just explaining this name is a toponym, this name is a name of people, this name is a name of hero, and so on. And this, from this let's say footnotes would be for us glosse, people was learning about geography in ancient times. If we put together all this glossae or this scholiae, all this X, so ainos, it's a polis, Greek polis, I would say, okay? If you put together all this, you make lists and you make lexica, isn't it? And we have this kind of lists already in Hellenistic times, so already in Alexandria, Callimachus, for example, tried to put together for teaching purposes all the rivers of the earth. And then we have the same tradition later with this Laterculus Alexandrinus, so lists of toponyms, hydronyms, people names. You just learn by heart. That's, for example, the Rhodanus, the Rhine is in Iberia, so the Tiber is near Rome, and so on. And this is what people already did or do after, as well in the western part of the world. So we see this with Livius Sequester, a Latin author of the 1st century AD, transmitted from manuscripts of the 9th century AD. So simply learning by heart. So Alpheus, for example, we have here, it's a river which goes up to the island of Sicily, of course, from the Peloponnesus. So this is something that a scholar of the 1st century AD in the Latin West was learning, and also in the 9th century AD. What's happening in the East? Well, we have this important text of Stephanus of Byzantium, or rather, we have the abstract, the summary, which was made quite quickly after the writing of the lexicon of Stephanus of Byzantium and preserved to our day. So a compilation of this kind of scholarly notes and of other lexica whose tradition go back to Alexandria. And from this lexicon of Stephanus of Byzantium, people in different times pick up their information and learn in schools about strange names they could not explain otherwise. Okay, and I put here a text about which I worked a lot in Romania, so about Orgame, an ancient city near Istria, because I think it's interesting in order to understand how we misinterpret the abstract of Stephanus of Byzantium and what we could expect from a lexicon of 6th century, so an abstract of lexicon of the 6th century AD. So this text is about this city, Orgame, which is a city at the mouth of the Istros, and this comes from Hecataeus Europae. It's a text of the 6th century BC, and then Stephanos, or the guy who made the abstract, says Orgamenai. There is also a city in Illyria, and the ethnicon is Orgamaios. For the second name, the ethnicon is Orgamenios. So we see already here that this is not a real geographical text, even if we use it for geography and in order epitoistro at the mouth of the Istros, or we use it for archaeology and so on, or for history to say, look, this was already founded in the 6th century BC. But what we have in this Byzantine text of the 6th century AD, it's a dictionary about shapes, about words. What is interesting for Stephanos is how to form the ethnicon, to make the derivation from a geographical name to a name of person, and how to distinguish between different ethnic names. Okay, so we also see that he quotes the sources sometimes, and Hecataios was probably already lost in the 6th century AD when he is writing, so he could take this reference from an Hellenistic lexicon, we don't know. But in any case, if he quotes Orgame, he does not quote it because it was a very important city in the 6th century BC or in the 6th century AD. The only interest of Stephanos of Byzantium is to make clear the phonology, the lexicology of the names, to bring together as many Greek names as possible, and to make exercises of how one would derive the ethnicon from the name. So this is very important to remember. This is why also, if we have here Orgame in Hecataios, it is maybe because the city was quoted by Hecataios and did not appear in other authors like Herodotus, and this is different from Istros. So one has to understand the logic of these school lists, which are compiled in lexica, when one tries to take historical and archaeological and geographical information from this source. So this is just teaching of asking students to learn by heart words. If we go at another level of geographical teaching, from antiquity and to Byzantium, we have lists of these words which have some meaning, because we can have lists of words which are arranged alphabetically, like in Stephanos of Byzantium. He just brought together all what he could find in alphabetical order, or we can have by order, because we can have the names which appear in Homer, so a lexicon of Homer, okay? But we can have also a geographical order. And in this case, our list of names would be an itinerary, if it is on the land, or a periplos, a navigation as an itinerary, if it is on the sea. And in fact, the ancient people, the ancient Greeks, liked a lot to write this periploi, so description of different points. So I'm going from the harbor Ha to harbor B to harbor C to harbor D. Sometimes they were indicating in what people this harbor are. So we are in this hodological, in this itinerary, in this linear perception of space, like metro maps. And sometimes they were giving also the distances. Now the problem of the distances is very big, because of course they were not measuring it, especially on sea, with a meter or with some mechanism, but they were taking medium distances expressed in days and nights of navigation, and then they were making approximations. And this is how we can read the periploi, so the description of navigations between different points. And we have several periploi from antiquity transmitted through Byzantine times. We can see that they were read, sometimes read by scholars in Byzantium. In any case, the copies are from the 9th century AD and then from the 14th century AD. But yeah, there is a reception of this periploi. We have two traditions of geographers, two big corpora with several manuscripts of each tradition. And if for the first, the earliest manuscript, this Palatinus Heidelbergensis, goes to the 9th century with copies in the 14th century. For the second tradition, second group of periploi, the earliest evidence is the 13th century manuscript of Paris, Parisinus Supplementus Graecus 443. What is interesting is that even if the corpora, the two manuscripts, are only 9th and 13th century, both corpora, so both compilations of texts, must go back to late antiquity, probably to the 6th, 7th century AD. So we could say that in Byzantium, people only copied this corpora together. And from the 13th century onwards, we have also some crossings between these two big corpora of itineraries. Now the question of the maps. So in the west also we have lists and maps, but as I told you, from the 6th century AD, there are no more maps in the Byzantine tradition. However, in the west, we can see that we can have the itinerary, and the itinerary can be put on a drawing of 2 dimensions, as for example, in this Albi map of the 8th century. To make a drawing in order to show the relative position of 2 places, it's something which exists in different cultures. We have this in the Chinese culture, in Iranian cultures, and we have it from Hellenistic times also, at least at the latest in the Western countries. And we have Polybius, so the Greek author of the 2nd century, who explained us that it is better to put things on a map in order to put the toponyms in relationship one with the other, because if you just learn a list of words, as we saw that the people were doing in antiquity at Byzantium, you will not understand much from an historian. Then when you read, you will just know by heart, okay, I heard about that name and this is in such land. But if you make a drawing and you put in relationship one things toward the other, so if you represent a territory, a region, if you make a chorographic map, so as the earth would be flat and you just put toponyms in relationship with the other, then you will be able to understand better the text and to memorize them. So this is a situation in Byzantine, in antiquity and in Byzantium. In Byzantium, especially for the transmission of what we call the geography, and the Byzantine was the first to call Strabo the geographer, because in antiquity, as I told you, Strabo was considered as a historian. He wrote many books of history, but we preserved only the 17th book of geography, which are only an appendix of his history. So he wrote like 60 books of history about contemporary history, starting from the Mithridatic Wars of the first century BC to his time, Augustan times, beginning of the 1st century AD. And he made an annex describing the whole world, which should serve as a frame in order his reader to be able to situate the historical logos. This is what we preserved thanks to the ancient, to the Byzantines, and we know that they were reading Strabo. So Strabo was read by scholars at least from the 6th century, from the 1st century, I told you, AD with Athanasios. But his glories, it's in late antiquity, and 6th century AD, we have a lot of quotations from Strabo in Stephanus of Byzantium. We have evidence that it was really studied in the Platonic school, because we have from the 6th, 7th century AD several compilations from Strabo. We have quotations from Strabo in different glossae, in different commentaries of other texts. And then we find Strabo in the 9th century and so on. So it was a reading. So let's say that people in Byzantium took Strabo like a model of the earth and of the Roman world, the maximum expansion of the Roman Empire, the moment, moreover, which is contemporary with the birth of Christ. So this is why Strabo served as their references, and this is why he had such a huge fortune in Byzantium. Strabo's work is called Geography, but in fact, Strabo's Geography is not 17 books. Only the first 2 books are the description of the terrestrial globe. I told you that Eratosthenes invented the word geography, in my opinion, to describe to say that he's describing the earth as it appears on the sphere. But in fact, Strabo, after commenting during 2 books all what Eratosthenes and Posidonius did, he goes and makes chorography, so descriptions of places one related to the other without taking in consideration the sphericity, as most of the people were doing. And this chorography, so 15 books of description of places, itineraries and so, from west to east. He's going from Spain up to India in the book 16, and then finishes with Libya and Egypt in the book 17. This description of lands is one of the most important scholarly geographical text or reference in Byzantine times, as we see from different commentaries and so on. We have also quite an important manuscript tradition. Of course, it's nothing comparing with the other philosophers, with Plato or so on, but still we can establish how the manuscripts were copied and put them in relationship with different scholars, Byzantine scholars. For example, Eustathius, a big reader of Strabo, Tzetzes, Psellos, of course, later, Platon, of course, another guy who copied, so to say, and edited Strabo. So this would be the biggest names: Stephanus of Byzantium, Eustathius, Tzetzes, Psellos, Platon. When dealing with Strabo, they made Strabo the geographer by excellence. Another very important name about when one learned about geography and cosmography, about the world in general in Byzantium, is Pseudo-Aristoteles, the Treatise on the World, De Mundo, in the Perikosmou in Greek. And this was conceived as a letter of Aristotle to Alexander, but it's not from Aristotle, because geographical knowledge indicates that it was written only at the end of the 1st century BC, or the beginning of the 1st century AD. So we are again, just like in Strabo's case, at around the moment of the birth of Jesus Christ, and we are under the Roman Emperor Augustus. Yeah, so the author of this text must be a reputed professor of rhetoric. So we are again in the school, and we are trying, there is a professor who tried to make his students learn some things about the cosmos in order to understand texts, literary and philosophical texts. And the text is a compilation of different elements from different treatises of Aristoteles, and they are put in a broader Platonic context, with some Stoic and Neo-Pythagorean ideas. So it's a big philosophical mix. It still looks like Aristotle, but with a strong Platonic background and with some Stoicism in it. This text had a huge tradition in late antiquity and throughout Byzantine times. Not only in Greek, it is read and learned, but also it is translated from the 5th century AD onwards in Armenian. In Syria, there are at least 3 Arabic translations. They were not yet completely studied, each of them. And then several times translated in antiquity, and then also in medieval times, new translation into Latin. So this is because the plan is very simple, and there is a numerology inside, and it's just very well done for the school. So an introduction about the importance of philosophy, then what is the sky and the celestial sphere, then the earth and the seas with some elements of geography, then explanations of the meteorological phenomena, and then there is a very curious passage about God, and the world unity seen as a creation of God. This also explains why the text had such a huge success in monotheistic cultures, in Christianity, and also in the Arabic Islamic cultures, because it speaks about the God, Hotheos, okay? And it's a question why it is a Platonic, it's the Platonic theos, or it is something else. We can discuss about it, but in any case, one has to remember the Pseudo-Aristoteles on the world. It's the cosmography of everybody who wants to have an introduction about the cosmos, and is related with a philosophical school, not only in Greek, Byzantine, but also Armenian, Syriac, Arabic, and so on. So this means that all these people who had access to this text, who learned about this text, were knowing about the sphere, once again the terrestrial sphere, and then the celestial spheres. And this we know for antiquity. In Roman walls, all the educated Romans had spheres or imitations of spheres in their houses. And it continues to some point up to early Byzantine and early medieval times. We see still this kind of drawings which reproduces these spheres in the Latin, but also in Greek manuscripts, especially of philosophers. Another teacher of school who had a huge success in Byzantium is Dionysius Periegetes, okay, commented also by Eustathius. We have also in Byzantine times a rewriting of Dionysius Periegetes in prose because it is a poet. So Dionysius Periegetes wrote in Alexandria in the time of Hadrian, beginning of the 2nd century AD, wrote a poem describing, in again a chorography, a description of places one related to the other without taking into consideration the sphere. He described the world as it was known by the Romans in their time, and he was a school teacher. So he described this like Homer, imitating the style and the words of Homer. And his text was, as I told you, commented. So we have huge amount of scholia. We have the commentary of Eustathius. Later on, we have the transcription into prose. So this served as the main school book about the geography of the earth until more or less until the 18th century, and not only in the Greek Byzantine world, but also in the West through some Latin translations, because it was translated into Latin already in the 4th and again in the 6th century AD, Dionysius Periegetes. What is Dionysius saying? That the inhabited island, the oikumene, looks like a sphedone, so like a flint. So we have here Asia and Africa around the Mediterranean, and he starts from the column of Hercules and he goes over up to the limits of Asia and of Africa, describing country after country in a poetical. I told you it's Homeric. It's a teacher of rhetoric, of poetry in a school, who made this for his students who were reading poetry and needed some information in order to know where is, for example, the Black Sea or different rivers of Asia. Sphragus, Sphedone, because one does not have to forget, also it's my opinion, my interpretation, then the earth is a sphere and the land on which we live, it's only on an island on this sphere. We see that Dionysius was recommended in schools. We, of course, because we have references, as I told you, in the Western, but also in the Eastern, in the Byzantine times from all the periods, but we have clearly references to teaching with Dionysius. For example, in the 6th century AD, Cassiodorus says that when you teach in school pupils about geography, you have to take the map of Dionysius Periegetes, but we never preserve the map, and this is due to the lack of maps in the Byzantine tradition. You take the map of Dionysius Periegetes and you teach the student the places and how the lands and the people organize around the Mediterranean. In the Latin West, we have something which looks like a map which could be inspired by Dionysius Periegetes. This is, for example, the 10th century AD map of Cottoniana in the British Museum. You can see here, so oriented to the east one more time, it's Christianized, so to the rising of the Christ, of the sun. Europe is here, Mediterranean, Black Sea, Asia, it's up on the top. Jerusalem in the Latin tradition becomes more and more central, and then we have here Libya, Africa. But one more time, nothing of this in the Byzantine world. We still have something from the Byzantine world, a special copy from antiquity, and we have to be grateful to the Byzantines for that. This is Claudius Ptolemy, so the geographer for us by excellence, and who influenced, of course, all the cartographic tradition. Because in the 2nd century AD, so a little bit after Dionysius Periegetes, this scholar who made the poetry about the people and the lands, we have a philosopher, a mathematician, Claudius Ptolemy, who was a professor for astronomy and astrology. So he was a professor of the professors, I would say. He wrote manuals about how to teach, how to speak about astronomy and astrology. But also he wrote geography. But his geography was not in order to travel with it or in order to teach it in the school or to make contemplation. His geography is one more time an appendix to his work, but he's not an historian like Strabo. It is an appendix for his work on astronomy. So, as you know, in ancient times, there is no distinction between astronomy and astrology. No, there is a distinction, but it's not so opposite, and there is no good or bad connotation like in modern times. So astronomy is about studying and fixing the stars, and astrology is about interpreting, giving a meaning, a logos to the position of the stars. But there is absolutely no pejorative connotation for astrology. So Ptolemy was also an astronomer, but also an astrologer. And in order to make the horoscope of someone, to tell him how will be his life, you have to know where the person is born. And you have to know the coordinates, latitude, longitude of the place where a person is born, in order to decide where are the stars on the celestial globe, which includes the terrestrial globe on which was born the person. So it is for the purpose of astronomy, astrology, that Ptolemy collected all the toponyms, and he tried to calculate all the coordinates for all the places. And he also probably made maps, probably made a globe. We do not have this. What we have in Byzantine manuscripts of Claudius Ptolemy, there are maps which were certainly remade in Byzantine times, but especially we have a mention that the maps were made by a certain Agathangelos, if I'm not wrong. So it's a name which was associated more or less with an Alexandrian context of the 5th century AD. So again, late antiquity. So we do not have one single drawing that we could say this is a drawing, a map by Ptolemy, but Ptolemy wrote texts, probably in several versions, which were put together then in the manuscript tradition, because his geography is a little bit complicated. The 8th book does not pass together with the first 7 books. So from this one could fabricate maps at any moment. And these texts, of course, were transmitted through medieval manuscripts. So I put you here just the text. So what he does is a list of names, and then we have latitude and longitude for each one. So one, and in the introduction, he explains how one can build the map in order to do this kind of thing. Once again, they probably the Agathodaimon, excuse me, it's the name of the cartographer we have in some codices, Agathodaimon. It must be a late antique name, but we do not know in what measure the maps which are now in the manuscripts, in the Byzantine manuscripts of Ptolemy, were done by Agathodaimon, so 3 centuries after Ptolemy, or even in the Byzantine tradition. In any case, the text of Ptolemy allows us to make our own maps, and this is what we are doing as scholars, and also to admire the maps transmitted by the Byzantine manuscripts, which were probably used by astronomers and also by mathematicians, by philosophers. So we are at the highest level of geography. And yes, what he's explaining is also how to build the celestial sphere and how to measure the position of the stars. And what he's telling in the Almagest is quite known, once again, by astronomers and mathematicians in Byzantium. And of course, it has a huge reception in the Arabic world, where indeed it is the basis of all the Arabic geography and astronomy. It starts everything from Ptolemy, as it was seen in a later antiquity. There are very good books about the reception of Ptolemy. It's Patrick Gauthier d'Archer, La géographie de Ptolémée en Occident, but the first part it's also about Byzantium, and the first 2 chapters, and also about the reception of Strabo. We can read the tradition of the Neoplatonists in Cristina d'Ancona and other more recent papers. I have done also myself some things about Priscianus of Lydia, for example, the dialogues with Chosroes, with the king Chosroes, and the informations. And this has also a tradition through a very interesting transmission in the 9th century AD between Byzantium and the Latin West. It's one of the very rare translation in the 9th century AD from Greek to Latin. So Priscianus of Lydia. Then the last point I would like to discuss with you is this disappearance of maps. So relative disappearance, because I told you, of course, we have the maps of Ptolemy, which are probably done in late antiquity or invented, so to say, in the tradition of the manuscripts. We do not know. But once again, Ptolemy, it's only for astronomers, for mathematicians, for a very small public. We do not have in Byzantium maps as we have in the West. And especially it's surprising because in the 5th, 6th century AD, if there was a place where we had maps, it is the East, the Eastern world. So especially the Near East, I told you, between Alexandria, Syria, Anatolia, and so on, but the Near East in particular. So why the maps disappear after Cosmas Indicopleustes, after the 6th century AD, there where they were so numerous? To the small scale or to the bigger scale, to the if we do the whole world, or if the bigger scale, if we do only a region, we do not have absolutely nothing after the 7th century AD, except these copies of Ptolemy one more time, and these copies of Cosmas Indicopleustes, but these are only things which are reproduced from ancient models. Even in that manuscript of Moscow, I show you, it's manuscript from 14th century, but the map must certainly be from Roman, if not Hellenistic sketch. I try to, it's again an interpretation, and we can discuss about it, to explain this by the iconoclasm. So I think it's simply because the Byzantines stopped to do maps because of the iconoclasm, because the world was a reflection and was something done by God. And this is the reason, I think. And we do not have, of course, iconoclasm in the West, where the maps were used for teaching. As I showed you this map from the 8th century, Albi. It was in a school book of monks in the West, in order them to teach them the creation, to learn the creation, to learn the Bible, to learn the Exodus of the Jews from Egypt to Israel, to the Promised Land, and to learn the sites where Jesus lived, to learn the history of Christianization. This is why we have maps in the West, and to look at God's creation. And of course, here I show you the most developed, so the same most elaborate maps in the West in the 14th century, the big Mappa Mundi, like this Hereford Mappa Mundi, which reflect also a Neoplatonician vision of the earth, with Jesus on top of the map, with the paradise up, as you can see, and Jerusalem on the center. So it is a whole reflection about the relationship between God and the earth that we do not have in Byzantium. Why? Because of iconoclasm would be my suggestion. Thank you very much. So